we're going to be looking at the question of alcohol and drugs. How should Christians deal with these things? It's oftentimes a challenging question. We interact with them a little bit differently. On one level, for the most part, drugs are across the board illegal, unless, of course, prescribed by a doctor. And so illegal non-prescription drugs, we can flat out say those are certainly a sin, because they violate Scripture. Scripture tells us we are to the best of our ability, follow the laws of the land in which we inhabit. And so the standard that we are to operate under when discussing alcohol and drugs is that if the spiritual life, the Christian life, is a battle, if it's something where we're called to be set apart, called to be holy, not in a holier than thou, legalistic, I'm better than you attitude, but in a calling to be a holy people before a holy God, embodying God's character to our community around us. The question is, do alcohol and drugs fit into that anywhere? And so I want to talk about the drug side of it first. As I just implied, really anything that removes us from that spiritual battle or drastically impedes our decision making, we can confidently say is sinful, because it takes away our ability to follow God's character. And so, while we can confidently say most non prescription drugs are sinful simply on the basis that they violate the law, there are some drugs, such as marijuana, that's heavily contested. In some states, it's legal, in some states, it's not. Some states, it's medically legal, but it's not legal for recreational use. And for medical use, like any other drugs, if you have a doctor prescribe it for a medical condition, then the church is more than happy for you to engage in that as prescribed. But if our intended purpose of consuming marijuana is to escape our reality, to experience something different in a way that impedes our ability to make decisions, and that's a problem. So every Christian really has to answer for themselves the question of, does engaging with marijuana, assuming it's recreationally legal where you are, in many cases it is, does it impede our decision making, and does it impede our ability to represent God's character well? So the flip side of that is, of course, the alcohol aspect. And something that is important for us to keep in mind at the outset here is this is a relatively new conversation. Christians have generally treated alcohol as a settled issue for the first 1800 years of the church, being what is sometimes referred to as like a teetotaler, someone, a Christian who looks at alcohol and says consuming any amount of alcohol is sinful. That's a relatively new dynamic. For the most part, it came about in the 19th and 20th centuries with much of the temperance movement, and it is uniquely connected to American history. In fact, even the early Baptists, those who we often see as being very against alcohol, the early Baptists actively engaged in drinking. Elijah Craig, who was a Baptist minister in Kentucky, founded Georgetown University, is also the inventor of bourbon whiskey. It's generally credited to him. A lot of great theologians have not only said that drinking is okay, but have encouraged drinking, and it's been actively a part of their lives. The great theologian John Calvin negotiated, in fact, as part of his contract for working at a church, that he was to have an annual stipend of 250 gallons of wine. Martin Luther, the famous theologian that kind of kick-started the Protestant Reformation, his wife owned and ran a brewery. Now, with all that in mind, it is true that just because others have done something doesn't mean that we should. And Scripture does, in fact, talk about in several different places, namely Ephesians and Titus, just to name a few, how Christians should not engage in drunkenness and be slaves to alcohol. But yet, on the same token, in Deuteronomy 14, we see this section where the Israelites are being told what they should do with their tithes. And one of the things that God encourages them to do is engage in what was referred to as strong drink. And ancient sources tell us this would be similar to like a barley-based alcohol, not unlike what we would consider beer today. And so on one side we see God saying to his people, yes, you can drink alcohol. And on the other side we see God saying, don't engage in drunkenness and be slaves to it. So just like anything that he created for goodness, when it's perverted, then it becomes a problem. Yet the critiques that people make of alcohol from those who we might again call teetotalers can generally be put into two main categories: testimony and wisdom. So for testimony, the critique goes something like this. If your unbelieving neighbor sees you walk into a pub or a bar, then that will put your ability to share the gospel with them at risk. And now there is things that Christians can engage in that put your ability to share the gospel with people at risk. Um, and it can occasionally be true if you're perhaps someone who has struggled with alcoholism, or perhaps your neighbor struggled with alcoholism, or perhaps you're doing gospel work in a majority Muslim country. Absolutely, you should refrain from alcohol. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the gospel even shines brighter when Christians do things that actively dispense with wrong assumptions about the gospel. The second critique is the wisdom critique, and this is arguably has more credibility. And it typically goes something like this: it is simply unwise and unhealthy to engage with alcohol because um, on the unwise side, it's we might have people in our past and our close family connections who have struggled with alcoholism, and on the other side, it's just not good for you. And there's certainly credibility there. It is certainly unwise for any child to engage with alcohol, as any doctor will tell you, as their brains and bodies are still developing. That's why the legal drinking age is put at an older age. Drinking, of course, in excess is unhealthy. Not just is it unbiblical, but it's unhealthy and can negatively affect you. But if we take that logic all the way to say that when it's done in excess, it's unwise, it's not good for you. If we continue that logic, we can say coffee is a sin. We can say eating pork or barbecue or any of these things that's typically considered unhealthy for us is a sin. Anything in excess but can become unhealthy. Some will also say, well, I was an alcoholic in the past, or perhaps my cousin was an alcoholic. If you then take that to say, I should not drink alcohol, then not only are you right in saying that, but others around you are in fact given a biblical mandate to support you in that. If you take, I was an alcoholic in the past, or have a family member who was an alcoholic, if you take that to mean no one else around me or no one else ever should drink, then you've made an error, because the logic simply breaks down there. And while many would want to put alcohol and drugs into the same category, uh, it's not wise, because they're very different things. They interact with the body in very different ways, and scripture has very different things to say about that. So overall, like for those of us who have grown up in church communities um, where alcohol is seen as sinful, it would be healthy for us to consider a few things. It is only really Americans, and only in the last 200 years, um, where Christians have been even considering alcohol as sinful. Scripture does not forbid drinking alcohol. In several places, it even encourages it. Um, and if you or someone in your immediate family has ever struggled with alcoholism, yeah, you probably shouldn't drink alcohol. But you don't have a biblical basis to hold others to that standard. And it would be worth us considering how many have felt unwelcome in church because uh, they don't have an issue with drinking alcohol. We should never treat something that's not in the gospel as a justification to say someone cannot be in the church or should be uncomfortable in the church. So for drugs, illegal, um, illegal non-prescription drugs, definitely sinful. Marijuana is a hotly debated topic, but keep in mind, if it removes you from the spiritual battle, if it prevents you from being able to represent God's characters, it's best to stay away from it. Alcohol, it's not a sin. Drunkenness is. But we also have to practice wisdom when, where, and in what context we engage with it. So I hope you enjoyed the answer to this question, and I hope you let us know what you think in the comments.